Hello, my name's Edmund. I've been keeping bees for about 15 years, and for a number of those as a seasonal bee inspector working for the National Bee Unit in South Wales. As such, I saw lots of the nastier end of the bee disease spectrum, the more serious notifiable diseases, the rarer diseases, rare diseases that hopefully most of you will never see in your beekeeping careers. But I feel quite strongly that we, as beekeepers, as managers of livestock, in a sense, have got a responsibility, first of all, to ensure that we keep our own bees as healthy as possible for their own sakes, but also to stop the spread of any potential disease amongst the bees owned by other beekeepers. In my talk today, I will be covering these topics. So some basic apiary hygiene advice, some advice on different types of comb and frame management, a little bit of advice on setting up and siting apiaries, and then some guidance on the sorts of equipment that you're using, and finally some basic tips on recognizing bee diseases. Humans catch diseases, humans spread diseases, bees catch diseases, and bees spread diseases. But beekeepers can spread diseases as well. We know lots about the simple things that we as humans can do to help a human problem. And really, the bee solutions are just as straightforward. I'm sure after this last 16 months or however many months it is, we are all familiar with basic hygiene practices like washing hands, singing happy birthday while you're doing it, or daigi bach, depending on which you prefer, and basically sort of helping prevent the spread of infection from person to place to person and things like that. And it's really, really that easy if you're a beekeeper as well. The whole purpose of the washing hands thing, or in the beekeeping sense, washing gloves and equipment, is to remove potentially infective material, so that you're not zapping your hands with any sort of special antiseptic. We're not using, as beekeepers, we won't be using alcohol gel or anything like that. We will just be washing equipment to remove things like honey and propolis, basically, are the two main things, and also hopefully not, but bits of squashed bee. You should aim to build this basic hand washing process, equipment washing process, into your apiary inspections, and just make it a standard in your apiary inspections, to the point that it becomes unthinkable to do it differently. Goodness, who would have thought a year and a half ago that we would become accustomed to wearing face masks anywhere, outside a sort of a hospital setting? It's second nature to us now. Hopefully that will vanish from our lives sometime in the future. But really, I want you to get used to sort of building these basic hygiene processes into your everyday beekeeping. A fundamental part of this is what we wear on our hands. Now, I rather stupidly started my beekeeping career without any gloves, because I didn't have any. But after a few stings, my hands, after the first sting, my hands swelled up like balloons. So I soon got myself a pair of leather gauntlets. Advantage of those is that the bees find it difficult to sting through the leather, but they're not sting proof because they can sting through the stitching. Disadvantage is that they don't take to cleaning very well, actually really at all. And I would as my main, if you could take one thing away from this presentation today, it would be please try and use some disposable nitrile gloves, or on the following slide I'll show you a picture of just marigolds, something that is thinner than the traditional leather gauntlets, and also reacts a bit better to being immersed in warm water. You don't have to use these disposable nitriles as disposables, depending on how many hives you look at and how rough you are when scrubbing them. They will last a few inspections, so it's not like you have to sort of chuck them away every time when just looking at your own bees. Marigold gloves, other glove manufacturers are available. Marigold gloves are really good as well, slightly thicker than the nitrile, so a little bit more protection. Again, not completely sting proof. The nitrile gloves, you'll quite often find that the bee's stinger sometimes kind of sort of bounces against the nitrile and then sort of comes out without stinging, but they do sometimes sting through it as well. And, you know, obviously, if you're a beginner beekeeper, as you get more experience, your handling of the bees should become more targeted and perhaps gentle, and that will sort of you'll get a sort of a benefit from the bees of having fewer disgruntled bees, and you'll get less stings. It's difficult when you're starting out. You tend to get more stings when you're starting out because you're not as confident handling the frames and things like that. But marigold gloves are very good, and a pair of those should, you know, sort of last you half a season or a season, depending on what sort of wear you give them. They will absolutely stink on the inside after a few uses, so I'd always recommend when you take them off to dry them inside out, because honestly, it's an aroma that can linger on your hands for days, however much you scrub them. So yeah, you get used to it, but maybe not everyone else around you will get used to it. So bear that in mind. So the basic apparatus for hygienically handling these is some sort of washable, waterproof-ish sort of glove, as the nitrile or the washing up gloves, and this magic stuff, which is washing soda. Depending on where you buy it, it costs around about £1 a bag, and it will last for a little while, and you need to sort of make it up into approximately 200 grams per litre of water. I think that the bags are 1 kilo in weight, so 1/5 of a bag into a litre of water. Doesn't matter if you make it a bit stronger. I'll explain. The purpose of the washing soda dissolves propolis like magic. So when you think of your gloves and your hive tool and your smoker, you're wanting water to wash off any sticky honey that might be on there, and washing soda with just a drop of washing up liquid to dissolve any propolis that might be on your gloves or hive tool or smoker. Once you've scrubbed those bits of equipment with the washing soda, there's nothing left really to spread disease onto the next hive that you look at. So it's fantastic stuff. It's cheap. I think it sort of degrades quite well in soil and things like that. The bees don't mind it. It's not some deadly pesticide that kills 99% of known germs. All it does is it dissolves the propolis and washes the honey off, meaning that you're okay to go on with another inspection or your inspections the next time. So these are the offending articles, an old pair of my beekeeping gloves, which are now just used for occasionally putting brambles up in places. as you can see, they're filthy, and they were pretty much filthy like that before I started pulling brambles up with them. I've already said that I started off beekeeping without gloves, and then I bought a pair like this. I suppose I should have invested to have some fancy glove manufacturer in Piccadilly or something like that, or Bond Street, make me a lovely skin tight pair, but I just got these clumpy things, which are the general duty beekeeping ones, because they weren't made by an exclusive tailor or glove maker. They don't fit my fingers. I think some of them are almost twice as wide as my fingers, and it meant that when I was handling the frames, I kept getting there's bits of leather stuck underneath the lugs, which made me clumsy, and which the bees didn't like. And as well, although the leather does stop you getting stung pretty much, the bees can sting through the lines of stitching, which is extremely painful when it's on the end of the finger. So I would never wear a pair of these again. I would go back to bare hands if I didn't have any disposables or marigolds literally at hand. So yeah, wearing disposables or marigolds will make you much more nimble in terms of handling your bees. I understand that it might be a bit of a shock to the system to sort of potentially have so little protection between you and the end of a bee's backside, but what I would say is that the increased delicacy of touch that you have when handling the bees will probably save you from a few stings itself. So I'd very much recommend you doing away with these whenever you feel confident enough to, and moving on to the marigolds or the disposables. So these are things that you need to be aware of to help restrict the spread of disease between your own colonies and certainly between apiaries. Propolis, wax, honey, and bits of young and adult bees all potentially carry infective materials. So, where possible, avoid moving these between colonies. So the word is avoid. I'm not saying don't ever do it, because for things like if you've got a queenless colony and they've raised queens, but something's gone wrong and you need to bring in a frame of brood to sort of check whether they are queenless, you're going to have to move a frame of brood from another colony. In situations like that, you just have to do it. But the word is avoid. It's much easier, with the washing process and using the right gloves. Then it's very easy to avoid moving propolis and honey residues and bits of bees between colonies. And the easiest way to do that is to clean your hive tool, gloves, and smoker frequently and regularly. Certainly, if you've got two apiaries, clean all those bits of equipment before moving on to your second apiary. That would avoid moving disease between apiaries. Some people clean equipment between colonies. I don't myself, but if I have had, if my gloves have got very sticky with propolis, or I've had to maybe squash some bits of honeycomb down to make them fit, then and the hive tool is very sticky, then I'll certainly wash that in the soda bucket, because it means when I go to look at the next colony, I'm not the first thing that would happen is that the bees would just come and sniff your gloves and hive tool and get in the way. So having a clean hive tool will reduce the amount of attention that the bees are paying to you, because obviously your hive tool, if you don't wash it, it's going to smell like the previous colony, and they might think that that's a bit of an intrusion possibly. So bee suits can be cleaned very easily, although not everyone is aware of that. A lot of them I can't say for all of them, but I use BBware Suit and another one which I don't know the name of. I think it might be a B Basics. The BBware one, I take the hood off and I put it in the arm. It's just a jacket, so I zip up the jacket and put it in the washing machine. For the B Basics one, I tend not to wash the hood, but I wash the jacket regularly because it gets stinking over the season, and bits of honey and propolis and stuff. So I wash that quite regularly. If possible, don't drop bits and pieces on the floor. Certainly, if you just scrape some propolis off a top bar or something like that, do something with it. Don't drop it on the floor. Stick it in the smoker. The smoker will burn it eventually. If you accidentally let some honey fall out of a comb onto the hive stand, wipe the hive stand with water from the honey bucket. From the washing soda bucket, sorry. And then this is something that I aim to do. I usually do every winter. Sometimes I do it in the spring, but I try to do it before I put equipment away in the winter. I will scorch all my unused boxes, scrape them free of propolis and beeswax, which I will tend to burn on a bonfire. Or put it onto newspaper and burn it in the stove. And so I know that when I'm storing equipment, it's pretty clean and ready to be used on a colony in the springtime. And yes, so keep your apiary tidy. Lovely picture of how not to keep your apiary. So this is an apiary I came across a little while ago. The beekeeper had bitten off more than he could chew. Didn't have time to go around. I think was getting quite panicked with bees, and you can see the mess that it's been left in. You may not be able to see, but in the top left-hand corner of the picture, there's remnants of comb on frames there. I think originally just a load of perhaps empty, maybe half-full honeycombs had been left on the top. There was a colony, I think it was a colony of tree bumblebees in that hive, but those frames with their propolis and remnants of honey would have been lying around for any colonies in the area to come and rob. If there was some serious, there wasn't, but if there was serious disease on them, then that would have been spread around. And that picture was taken in within a sort of a 5k disease area. So don't leave stuff like that lying around in your apiary. Tidy it up. As much as anything, it's a trip hazard for you. So keep your equipment tidy and bee proof. And don't leave wax and frames and things lying around. More often than not, you won't know, if you go to pick up a swarm, you won't know where the swarm came from. So you have to treat it as being diseased, on the assumption that it might have come from a diseased colony. If you've got a lovely apiary of, sort of 4 beautiful colonies, and you just sort of pick up a swarm at random that definitely isn't one of yours, they never are, but that definitely isn't one of yours, you just don't know what it's bringing with it. When the bees swarm, they will fill their honey stomachs with honey, and the honey can contain infective agents. It won't necessarily kill the adult bees. They will use some of it for they'll metabolize it and start making comb in the new site. But if they go to perhaps a hive that you put them in, and if you've used some drawn comb in there, then they will start storing that honey and introducing, basically sort of embedding that infectious material in your new hive. So you can't prevent that from happening, but what you can do is sort of keep that colony in a sort of isolation in your apiary. So if you've got, say, four colonies in your apiary and the swarm is the fifth, then look at that one last after you've looked at your other four. Wash and make sure you wash your inspection equipment after you've looked at the swarm. If you're looking at it first, then make sure that you wash your inspection equipment before going on to your other colonies. Try and record where and when it's collected. It's just useful. You might remember, which is fine, but if you're in a habit of picking up lots of swarms in a season, try and record where it's been collected, so that if there is any, hopefully not, but if there is any disease identified over the coming weeks, then you can sort of give the bee inspectors some heads up on that. Sorry, I hate that phrase, heads up, but there we are. Leave for 2 or 3 days before feeding. That's to basically force the bees to metabolize the honey that they've brought with them and turn it into beeswax. I did collect a very small swarm, the remnants of a swarm, once, and it was about the 5th day of rain that I got called out, and they were a poor tiny thing. I had to give them a bit of food then, but other than that, I don't feed my swarms at all, I'm afraid. They're set up for building wax. They're also made up of entirely foraging bees. So once they get a new home, they'll just go out and find whatever's around, unless it's an absolutely awful, wet, cold summer without any chance of them getting forage. I'd really hold off from feeding them at all, personally. And so what you need to do is, for the first 6 weeks after you've got the swarm, I say inspect after all your other colonies, clean hive tools, and etc. If possible, keep them in a separate apiary. I realise that's not always a possibility, but just sort of treat them as a little sort of apiary within an apiary, and treat them differently to your other colonies. And keep your swarm collecting equipment clean. So if you use a wooden swarm collecting box, you can scorch it afterwards. Polystyrene boxes are fantastic for swarm collecting, but they are much more difficult to keep clean. So be aware of that. Sterilising polystyrene requires immersing in a bleach solution. It's more difficult. But what you're doing is, try and do everything to sort of minimise the risk of passing diseases on to other colonies. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about comb management. So the brood comb is the area of the hive that will contain the most infective materials, and that's everything from minor things like chalk brood spores to very nasty things like American foul brood spores. Much less likely to be in any of the honey supers. They're there where the bee's day-to-day activity is carried out in the brood box. Some of the diseases only affect the young bees, so that's where you're going to find the most of the infected material. In days of old, when people just kept bees in skeps or bees in the wild colonies perhaps would sort of last a few years and then die out for one reason or another. Wax moth would come along, eat most of the comb, so when another swarm perhaps went into the cavity in the tree, they would build their own comb, and hopefully most of the old wax had disappeared. with the old skep keeping methods, they tended to kill the bees at the end of the year, so you didn't get much bee disease transferred that way. But with the advent of the movable comb hive, with what's his name, Reverend Langstroth, then we've given the bees the basis for their own combs, and if we were, well, the nice easy thing is just to keep those combs in place year after year after year, and they just go blacker and blacker and blacker. The bees will still use them, but it's not ideal because even minor diseases, the infections can build up in them. So ideally you'll want to renew each comb every 2 to 3 years, and it's kind of, it's something you get into a habit of, but it can be a little bit tricky sometimes. So I'm going to sort of give you some suggestions. It does need some thought and planning. You can't just drop new sheets of foundation into a hive in September, because when you come to look at the hive in late March, April, those new sheets of foundation will still be there, although they'll be a bit more brittle and the bees won't really want to do anything with them. So it does need some thought and planning. And one of the things that you have to remember is so building new comb is, I suppose, to use a sort of a money example, bees only build comb when they've got income coming into the hive in the form of nectar from outside or syrup that we feed them. They won't do any house building from their savings, which is their stored honey. Stored honey stays where it is. They only build comb in response to needing a space to build it. So they don't build comb in the winter because there's pretty much never any nectar coming in the winter. So they build it at certain times of year. The important thing with this is that there are sort of simple methods of changing comb, renewing comb, and complicated methods. I'm a simple person, but if you like the sort of the look of some of the more complex methods, then it's really finding one that suits you. Lots more information available on the Welsh Beekeepers Association website, WBKA.com, although I think they're changing the website, but presumably they're changing the address. They're keeping the address, but the sort of the breadcrumbing that I've given you there might not be applicable any longer. But I'm sure if you go on to when they do have a new website and you search for comb management, the documents will come up. So this is the easiest method for putting in new comb. Now, what I've tried to do here is a sort of a cross-section of what a brood box would look like in the early part of the season. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Only 10 frames, so let's pretend it's a WBC. The black frames are the sort of the centermost part of the colony, with definitely brood in there at that stage. The red frames are on the periphery of the sort of the cluster of bees, the edge of the area of brood, and just beyond it. And then let's say that you are very organised, and in the September, before you close the bees up, you put some manky-looking older frames towards the edge of the hive. So when you come into the hive in the springtime, the frames in blue are hardly being used because the colony hasn't expanded very much. So now's the ideal time to take them out. Don't worry if there's a little patch of pollen or maybe even sort of the remnants of some honey at the very top of the frame. Just take the frames out. And what I would recommend is that you slip in 2 replacement frames in between the sort of the outermost frames of the brood area. So perhaps the first frame either end with no brood on it, and then the first frame with brood on it. That the bees will be encouraged by the warmth from the brood area to draw out the foundation. Sorry, when I say draw out, what I mean is really they're building their own comb onto the sheet of foundation that we've given them. But I'll call it drawing out. That's a generally used term. So yeah, the warmth from the cluster will encourage the bees. It'll make the foundation slightly more plastic, more pliable, and it'll encourage the bees to build on that. And then they'll still be using the outermost red frames, and it's got honey in or something like that. So that's the best way. That's a nice, what I think is a fairly easy way of getting new comb into the brood chamber early in the season. If you leave it in this part of South Wales, if you're sort of in Cardiff or something, lowland, rather than perhaps further up in the valleys, you can find that end of March, if you're in a good area, the bees are really expanding. So don't leave it too late, because you might have to sort of take out frames that are being used, but it is important to try and change most frames every few years. And what you're looking for as well is really the disgusting black frames. You can write dates on frames, but what you might find is that a frame that if I put in 3 frames into a hive with 2021, you might find at the end of the season they've used 2 of them loads and 1 of them they've hardly touched, so that one's going to be cleaner. So anyway, don't be sort of stuck by dates, but have a look and sort of see how misshapen or dark they're getting. Later in the season, and this is something that you will quite often see commercial, well, you might not see, but which commercial beekeepers are quite nonchalant about using sometimes. They'll just routinely sort of take out the peripheral frames, even if they've got small amounts of brood on. I don't mean very late in the season, I just mean later into the summer, and then they'll slip frames of foundation. They'll intersperse them with frames of brood. You do get some people objecting to doing this, but I've seen it done, and it's been absolutely fine. So again, it's up to you whether to try it or not. The blue arrows there obviously indicate the frames that are going to be removed, and then the grey arrows represent the new frames of foundation that you're putting in. As beginner beekeepers, we're always told not to split up the brood cluster. When it's at the height of the season, the bees are more inclined to tolerate it. I definitely wouldn't do it later in the season, and I definitely wouldn't do it early in the season. Just a picture of a very nice newish colony. You can see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 frames in the middle, where possibly the bees have been moved from a nuke, and you can see that they're on slightly older frames, but looking at the wax in between the frames, it looks sort of quite nice and sort of palish coloured, so hopefully they're not too old. And you can see that the 3 frames at either end brand spanking new frames with sheets of foundation, and the one that's being lifted up, the bees have worked very well, because it's one of the 2 frames that are closest to the cluster of bees. They're utilising the heat, and it just makes sense to them to move logically outwards. If you look at the very sort of front of the picture, you can just about sort of see the second frame in. It looks like a undrawn foundation there, and they haven't got as far as working that one out yet. At this stage, the frame that's being lifted up, it could, I can't see really, but it could possibly that they're just drawing it out and storing honey at the top. They may not be using it for brood. So if you wanted to, you could take out one of those, you could lift one of those undrawn frames from the very outside and slip it between the last of the old frames and that brood frame that's being held up. It's kind of forcing the bees to do perhaps a bit more work when they didn't immediately want to do it, but they'll start drawing out that sheet of foundation very quickly. Particularly if this is, I don't think it is, but if this were a swarm that's been collected in a nuke box, because swarms are geared up to building comb. So now I'm just going to talk to you a little bit now about a process called shook swarming. It can seem like a very drastic operation, but really we are just replicating something that the bees are used to in their normal life, that is swarming, and bees can absolutely thrive on it. It is a technique which is used by the bee unit for dealing with certain notifiable diseases, European foul brood, because when it's done in a particular way, you remove all the infective material and you have brand new clean equipment and frames, and so there's beyond the bees having some honey in their stomachs at the moment that they shake them off the frames, it's very unlikely that any disease will transfer across from the old equipment. But bear in mind, you're doing this just as an amateur, and the more you can get to the sort of the disease-free, the better. But it's a way of replacing comb primarily as in your sort of amateur beekeeping. What you do need is you need a complete clean hive, either a new hive or a scorched hive, brand new frames with foundation in, a dummy board, and a nice clean feeder. And I'm just running through it quickly here. You basically take the bees from the old frames and shake them into the new hive. The old frames are destroyed. I did see an article by Paul recently saying what to do with old brood frames. In this instance, you're likely to have larvae and sealed cells in the frames, so this wouldn't be a time to make candles from your old brood frames, I think, because there'd be too much gunk in with it as well. But yeah, that's just letting you know that. The process is independent of nectar flow, so you're not dependent on a nectar flow because you're going to be feeding them with syrup. The colony loses all its brood. That might seem drastic, but when you appreciate that when there's brood in a hive, 80% of the varroa mites are going to be hidden away in the brood, then this one treatment will remove 80% of the varroa population in the hive in one go. And it's also, the bees that are left are kind of sort of kidded into thinking that they've swarmed, in a sense. And I say bees can absolutely thrive on it. They go into sort of a emergency mode, I suppose, and they all the workers are recruited into, or as many workers as all the foragers are recruited into building comb and things like that. And as I said, it's very effective for controlling diseases. Step one is you've got your old hive in position with a queen in there. What you need to do is move that hive to one side, and on that original position put a new box with a floor, a queen excluder, brood box, and some frames in the brood box. Excuse me. You put it in the existing position so that any bees that are out flying will fly to the new box. As I put there. I'd forgotten I put that there. The new hive, you find the queen in the old hive, and if possible carefully place her on a frame in the new hive, and then frame by frame you take each frame from the old box, hold it over new box, if slightly, let's say you've only got 6 frames in the new box, so you've got a nice big gap in the middle, and then you push the frame, you lower the frame and give it a good hard shake, and all the bees will fall off onto the bottom of the hive, or in this case the queen excluder, and then they'll then crawl up onto the frames. When all that's done, you take the old box away, shaking any remaining bees into the new box. And after a few days, put a feeder on the top and feed the hive. There's a good video available on YouTube, which I'll tell you about now. I'll just keep on this step 4 at the moment. When we are doing shook swarms for European foul brood, you'll feed them a couple of days later, because you want the bees to metabolize every scrap of honey in their tummies to build wax, so that there's no honey left from the old infective hive. It's not quite so critical when you're doing it as a method of sort of getting new frames and things like this, but the closer you can get to that target, the more likely that all remnants of disease will be removed. So Stuart Spinks has got a very good video. I think it's a series of videos on YouTube about how to do a shook swarm. He's using slightly different equipment. I think he used polystyrene hives, but he's not doing it as a he's not doing it because there's any disease, any notifiable diseases. He's just using it on his bees. He's just doing it as a demonstration. And I'd recommend you going to look at those, search for those on YouTube, and you can just about see he's pointing to the queen who's got a yellow spot on her back there. The queen excluder is there just in case, when the bees are all in their nice new hive with nice new foundation, they decide that they don't like it and scarper off into a tree somewhere. So, but after a week or so, the queen will have started laying, so you can remove the queen excluder and allow any drones that might be in there to get out. I say it's used by the NVU to control European foul brood, and it's got as well as having benefit on the levels of varroa, it's got benefits in terms of nosema, chalk brood, and other pests. Not least of which is wax moth, things like that. As I said at the beginning, it does seem drastic, but colonies thrive after being shook swarmed. So this is just to recap what I've talked about. The aim of the shook swarm is that you have an old box, old frames, move it to one side, put a new box in its place, carefully transfer the queen across, and then frame by frame from the old box, give the frames a short, sharp downward shake, and once you've done all those frames, shake the remaining bees from the actual physical box and any other bits and pieces. Try not to tip the whole floor in, because you'll get all the bits of propolis that go with it, and you're trying to keep those out. And then once all the bees are in, put the full complement of frames in, including a dummy board, because dummy boards are good things, which is why I insisted on one being there. And then after a day or two, feed them, and that feed will help them, will encourage them to draw out to the comb, and you will have a whole box full of lovely drawn comb in no time, and you will have lost all the nasties, even if they're only mildly nasty things like chalk brood and wax moth larvae, and a good chunk of the varroa mites in the old box, and you'll need to dispose of the combs accordingly. I'm now going to talk a little bit about a Bailey comb change. It's it's quite a popular way of changing combs, but not with me, because as I said, I like to do simple things. Shook swarm is about as far as I go. I'm very comfortable doing shook swarm. Bailey comb change needs sort of slightly sort of different handling of equipment. So this uses again, you will need, rather than an entire new hive, you will need a new brood box, framed foundation and feeder. Unlike the shook swarm, you keep everything in the original position. You don't sort of do two hives side by side. And it's a process of waiting for, you put the new brood box on top of the old brood box, you wait for the brood in the old box to hatch, and then you take the old box away. But I'll go through it step by step now. And again, the old frames and empty frames are destroyed. But as with the shook swarm, it's independent of nectar flow because you are going to be feeding the bees syrup. It's not as useful for disease control because you're keeping the old brood frames and the new brood frames in more or less constant contact with each other. So, excuse me, this is a way of controlling disease. This is a way of getting new frames, not necessarily controlling disease. This is a sort of a more detailed view of what I talked about before. But I am going to go through it in more steps after this slide. So step 1, you've got your hive with the old comb and the queen in it. Step 2 is to take a new, a clean brood box full of foundation and just simply put it straight on top of the old brood box. And then on top of that, you put a feeder with food in it. Your ultimate aim is for the bees and the queen to move into that top box. You'll then put in a queen excluder, the red line in step 4, to keep the queen up there, and then you can step 5, you can remove the old brood box after a certain amount of time. So I'll now go on to looking at each of those steps in more detail. So this is the sort of the step 1. Early spring, strong healthy colony with a laying queen and brood and stores. If there are any unused frames in there, take them away because you'll only be doing that later, and what you want to do is to encourage the bees to go up into the new box when it's put on there. Here you can see those thin black lines represent undrawn brood frames, and you put it straight on top of the existing brood box. So the old brood frames are down below with the young bees developing in them, new empty frames of foundation on the top, and on top of that, all below the roof, is a feeder with sugar syrup. Excuse me. The bees will get attracted to that sugar syrup. And as they feed on the syrup, they will, because those central frames are above the brood rearing area in the bottom box, they'll be utilising that heat. The heat will encourage them to draw out those central frames, and you can see the thickening of the black lines indicating that they're starting to build comb on those frames now. And when that comb has been developed enough, the queen will start to move up and use it for laying eggs in, and the eggs will hatch into larvae and so on. You need to get to that colony at the stage where the queen has just moved up and started laying in there. So you've got to be careful about inspecting the colony. What you wouldn't want to do is give it a load of smoke at the top when you go into the colony, because that's probably going to drive the queen back down into the bottom box. So maybe take the roof off, turn the roof upside down onto a hive stand, and then lift that top box complete onto the hive stand, have a look through there to see if the queen's there. Hopefully she will be there. If necessary, look through a couple of times. Hopefully she will be there, in which case you put a queen excluder on top of the old box, the bottom box, and put the new box back on top. You've now restricted the queen to that top box, and she can only lay in that top box. Over the next couple of weeks, all the brood that's down in the bottom box will hatch out and migrate up through the queen excluder to the top box. The queen's up in the top box, continuing to lay. Once she's up there laying happily and the frames are drawn, you can take the feeder away. It doesn't need to stay there. You don't need to keep feeding them for weeks and weeks and weeks. It's just to enable them to make a start on drawing out the foundation. Bees like to move up anyway, generally, so you shouldn't have any problem with them going up and drawing out that foundation. The knack is to catch the queen up there and get the queen excluder in. So you're going to have to be confident about spotting the queen. If you leave it too long, she'll start coming back down and laying downstairs, so you need to time it right. Once all that brood has hatched out, they'll more or less stop using it. They might sort of use it as a sort of a halfway house for, if there's a nectar flow on, they'll be sort of filling empty cells down there with nectar, which will be moved upstairs in the evening. But basically you can take that old brood box away now, and there you've got your it's the original colony of bees in a new box with new frames. So the old frames that you have taken away will be almost entirely free of brood, so you can definitely use those as Paul has suggested in the recent WBKA magazine for trying out making candles, if you like, out of brood frames. I'm afraid I'm not that adventurous. I tend to dispose of my old comb in other ways. I would burn the old frames, but you are welcome to very carefully clean them, but I would always recommend burning old frames. And then the equipment that you've taken away, the brood box, scrape it to remove wax and propolis, scorch it with a blowtorch, assuming it's not a polystyrene or a plastic one, and then it's ready to be used again for another colony. And important as well to wash the feeder with washing soda solution to remove any bits of propolis and wax, and scrape to get rid of wax that might have built up on there, so that again it's clean, infection free for when you're going to use it on the next colony. Once that brood box, the new brood box, starts to fill up, then just carry on as normal. Put a queen excluder on and supers when required, which might be immediately, depending on what time of year, what time of the in terms of nectar flow and things you do it. A few notes here about the Bailey method. There are lots of tweaks which can be made. At stage 3, the entrance can be closed off using a Bailey board, and when you let the brood in the bottom hatch out, if you might get sort of drones caught somewhere, and that can be awkward. But these are kind of refinements, and I wouldn't sort of try doing all the refinements in one go. I'd get used to the process and the sort of the logic of the process before you start sort of thinking, well, how can I tweak this? It will work without the refinements. So a quick run over it again. You have the old hive in the same position. You put a new box full of foundation plus a feeder on the top of it. You wait for the queen to go up. When you find her up there, seal her off from the old box by putting a queen excluder between the two. And then when all the brood is hatched out of the bottom box, take the bottom box away. This is another method that some people use. Basically, you use a brood box as a super. Now, you can either, and this is where I'm not particularly in favour of it, you can either use the brood box as a super if you've got an extractor that will take brood frames, but brood boxes full of honey weigh an absolute ton, particularly David, I'm sure you'll remember this, particularly if they are modified Dadant brood boxes. So for me, it's a recipe for a bad back. But what you can do is sort of more or less pick out the frames as they draw them out. It's kind of sort of pretty much self-explanatory. The longer you leave it, the fuller it'll get of honey. I'm just sort of giving it as an example of something else that people do. It's not something that I'd be inclined to use myself. I'm going to have a quick talk about what's happening to all these frames of foundation and brood, because frame spacing is a very important thing in your hive. It might not seem it, and the tolerances that bees work to might not be immediately apparent to you. But I've seen frames that I've seen hives that get they're in a terrible mess simply because people have left frames out, or they haven't wanted to move the frames close up to each other for fear of squashing the bees. But it's one of those things that you need to get into a habit of doing properly each time. So you can space the frames with in the brood box with Hoffman frames or plastic frame ends, or even my pet hate, I'm afraid, castellations in the brood box. It is easy to get right. All you have to do is, when you push a frame back, you make sure that one lot of plastic frames, the plastic frame ends touches the other plastic frame ends, or one piece of Hoffman edging touches the next piece of Hoffman edging, or the frames sit right in the castellations, and that you have the full complement of frames for that hive type. It's also easy to get wrong, and that's when disasters can happen. But even if you get it slightly wrong, it can make inspections more difficult and less appealing sometimes, because the bees will start filling up the space with brace comb, or they'll pull out the honey cells at the top of the frames, and then when you go and try and correct that spacing, you get honey oozing everywhere. So it's just something to bear in mind every time you're looking through a colony. Push the frames tight to one end when you've finished, and I would recommend that the gap that's left is blocked off using a dummy board. A dummy board doesn't have to fill the space that's left. All it is it forms a solid wall between the frames with wax in them and the edge of the hive, and the bees won't want to go around that solid wall and build wild comb in the space. They're easy to make. You can get a regular frame and slip some very thin plywood into where the foundation would go, or even the Correx, the corrugated plastic. They make pretty decent dummy boards, or you can buy them cheaply as well. But I'd strongly recommend that you have a dummy board in every hive. Push all the frames tight against one wall when you've finished, and make sure it's tight, and then put your dummy board in and push that tight up against the last frame, and that'll keep your frame spacing accurate. When you don't have your frame spacing accurate, you can quite quickly get things like this. It's not the end of the world, but if you had to go in, if the colony was about to swarm and you had to go and find the queen, I put money that she was tucked between the piece of foundation and that piece of wild comb, and you'd never find her. So it just makes your beekeeping slightly trickier, and we don't really need that in our beekeeping. So keeping the frame spacing accurate and consistent is a really helpful thing for your beekeeping. And I'm just showing you, this picture is from a very interesting and informative website called theapiarist.org. And you can see down the big red arrow is pointing to the dummy board there. This beekeeper is using Hoffman frame spacing. You can just about fit 12 Hoffmans in a hive. It's a nightmare to get the first one out, so 11 Hoffmans plus a dummy board is a very good setup in a brood chamber. Just a quick word now about apiaries and sort of setting them up and managing them. So the number of hives in your apiary does or will tend to expand to fill the time available for their inspection. It's just an inevitable thing. Well, hopefully it's an inevitable thing. If you've only got one at the moment, it might seem a bit of a precarious situation, but once you get to swarming season, you can quite often find that doubles the next year and so on. Which means that if you think that, if you can only look at your bees on a Saturday, if you work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, if you can only look at your bees on a Saturday afternoon and you're comfortable with doing 4 inspections on a Saturday afternoon, and you end the winter with you end the summer with 4 hives, then the chances are, as long as you feed them properly, that you can have 4 hives the next spring, which may well turn into 6, 7 or 8 pretty soon. So just bear that in mind, and consider uniting colonies at the end of the winter. Lots of advice online and in books on how to do that. It basically involves a couple of sheets of newspaper and removing the queen. But yeah, uniting colonies can help you keep the vast overwhelming majority of your bees, apart from the odd queen. But it also means that it'll reduce your stress levels perhaps the next year. As I mentioned before, bees are pretty tolerant about where they're kept. They don't particularly need to be in a east, west, south or north facing location. They've got their preferences, but they'll tolerate pretty much anything. The important things for you to consider are, is it safe keeping bees there for other people, and is it safe and easy for you to access the hives? Because if it's not safe and easy, you're either going to end up with a broken leg or a hive on top of you, or you're going to be, if you're sort of so cramped that you can hardly pick up a frame, it's not going to be a pleasant experience for you, and you may well sort of start to get reluctant about going to look at the bees. It's always worth keeping an eye out or an ear open for new apiary sites. If you suddenly find, if you're a little bit doubtful about where you've got the bees at the moment, and you suddenly find in August that you need to move them, that's the time when it'll be most difficult to find a new apiary site. So just sort of, keep things in the back of your mind. But having said that, it's always nicest, I think, to keep your bees at home, because that's usually where all your equipment is and everything. If you do lose a colony over winter, and you're not sure of the reason why, seal it up and contact a bee inspector. I would say that some beekeepers, sometimes it might seem that beekeepers are resigned to losing colonies over winter, and I think that winter losses should be exceptional rather than the norm. If you have strong colonies, well fed going into winter, with low varroa levels, then you should have those colonies come out of winter again. Things like queens going drone laying can happen, though. It's unlikely that your colony will die over winter from a notifiable disease. They're diseases of the brood, so that's more likely to happen in the summer, but it could happen in the winter. And if you're at all worried, contact a bee inspector to come and have them inspected. Moving on to the next slide, just a picture of a mad, bizarre apiary in Hubei province in China. Goodness, it obviously works for them. My absolute worst nightmare, climbing up those cliffs to collect, to check bees. So I just thought I'd put that in for amusement. And then a quick word about equipment. You've probably paid good money for your equipment, so try your best to keep it in good order. When you're storing equipment after use, clean it to make sure it's ready for use again. You always need frames with foundation in. If you suddenly sort of need to sort of collect a swarm that's hanging in a tree and you haven't got any frames with spare frames, you'll be in a bit of a pickle. So make them up perhaps over the winter. What I tend to do is I tend to store my brood frames with foundation in vertically. In sort of plastic boxes, big plastic boxes with lids, vertical so that the comb doesn't, the foundation doesn't deform, doesn't bend, which it tends to do if it's lying down. And then they're sort of ready for use next season. You always need, one colony of bees and one hive isn't enough. You always need spare bits of equipment. So factor that in. Have you got sort of a nuke box if you need to collect a swarm or you need to sort of take the queen out or something like that. So always have a little bit of spare equipment, and I say make sure it's clean when you store it. Poly nukes are particularly useful. They're nice and light and insulated, good for very, very useful for collecting swarms, although not so great for sterilizing afterwards. And this next slide is just a picture I showed earlier of the apiary, which was in a terrible mess. And please just sort of, your apiaries aren't going to end up like that, but please be careful about leaving old equipment around. It's not just your equipment. It could be sort of spreading disease to other apiaries in the area. So coming on now to talk a bit about diseases. And on this slide, I'm just sort of talking about some of the things that you need to get used to in order to be able to have a chance to spot diseases. The main thing to remember is that you are going to be looking at the comb and not the bees. And that you need to look at every cell. For beekeepers like myself, domestic beekeepers, we never generally get the chance to see enough bees to start seeing lots of disease, because thankfully most of the rare ones are, most of the very serious ones are rare. But what you need to get in the habit of looking at is healthy brood, recognizing cells of healthy brood, and then questioning things that you're not sure about, that don't look like healthy brood to you. When I started out, I panicked. At the time, I was looking after the Association, Cardiff and Vale Beekeepers Association library, and I closed up the hive and ran upstairs to look through all the books, looking to see what disease I had. And it was only a panicked phone call to Peter at Nature's Little Helpers that I found out that it wasn't a disease. It was actually probably blackberry pollen stored in my cells. That it's sort of a greyish pollen that freaked me out when I first saw it. So you probably may have embarrassing moments like that, but that's better than just sort of shrugging your shoulders and saying whatever, check it out, look online, and sort of try and track down what the odd cells looking at are actually, but if not, speak to another beekeeper. This looking at every cell is very important. We use movable frame hives, and the benefit of that is that you can pick the frames up, look at both sides of them, look at each cell and see whether there's disease there or not. If you have been given or inherited a hive that's got frames that are nailed down, Or if you keep, unlike what you might read in magazines, if you keep bees in a skep and you're not willing to cut the comb out, then you're not going to tell whether the bees are healthy or not, because you won't be able to see into the cells. This looking at what's healthy, identifying what's healthy, is a good way of spotting the oddities then. And looking for disease, and you have to believe me with this, honestly, will improve your beekeeping, because you start taking in a lot of the information that's going on in the hive in a different sort of way. So you will start noticing things that you don't notice if you just look at the bees on the surface. You might start seeing, occasionally you'll see two queens in a hive if you're looking in great detail, and then perhaps you'll see two eggs at the bottom of a hive, and occasionally you might even see two larvae at the bottom of a hive. So the amount of attention that you pay when you're looking for disease will repay you in other areas. It's not something you have to do on every inspection. A couple of times a year should be fine. Bee inspector visits are free of charge. So if you have concerns, contact your local bee inspector. And occasionally there are bee workshops, disease workshops in certain areas. And if I was you, I'd take up a chance to at least attend one of those when you can. I've taken some scans now from the Haynes Bee Manual that the association uses, and this first picture is comes under the heading Healthy Brood, and there's lovely plump C-shaped pearly white larvae. I call them sort of the tinned mandarin look, where you can see each of the segments in the larvae. But if you have a little look, there's a sort of a slightly odd looking cell over there. So although this is a picture of Healthy Brood, and it is Healthy Brood, I'd be wanting to look at where that arrow's pointing. I suspect it's possibly an old cell with pollen in it, but I'd be getting a stalk of grass or a cocktail stick or something and having a little prod around in there to see what I could identify it as. Here are some more pictures from that book of Healthy Brood. Again, top picture, lovely pearly white, shiny C-shaped larvae. Ignore the darker ones. I think that's just an effect of the lighting. And then you've got these lovely sort of matte cappings of the sealed brood. And at the bottom there, it looks like the beekeeper is maybe just sort of scraping back a cap. He's seen one with a perforation in, just to have a look what's there. You can see he's using a half brood frame, so a super frame that he's using as a brood frame. Next slide. All this means that one of the essentials for doing disease recognition, for seeing how healthy your bees are, is good eyesight. Having eyesight that can read those letters isn't good enough. You need eyesight that can read those letters, that can look at the bottoms of cells. My eyesight is generally the former without my contact lenses in. I've got pretty poor eyesight. It's good when it's corrected, but with age, it's struggling a bit, certainly in low light. Next slide. So I would always suggest that you carry a little torch with you. You can get some fantastically bright little LED pocket torches now, and sometimes if you're looking at your bees and the sun's not at the right angle, a torch can just help you see to the bottoms of the cells. Take a magnifying glass as well if you want to. They can always be useful. I always like to, if I can, look at the bees when I've got the sun coming over my shoulders, so it shines. I can lift the frame up and it'll shine at the bottom of the cells. It's not always possible, but when I was earlier talking about sort of sighting your apiary, the bees don't really need sunshine, but it is helpful to you as a beekeeper to have access to sunshine on the few days when we have it in the year. So that you can see what's going on clearly in your hives. If your eyesight isn't tip-top, and if a magnifying glass and an LED light don't really do the trick, then invite a friend round. Two sets of eyes can often be better than one. So perhaps if you have started your beekeeping career on a course and other people, perhaps for the first sort of year or two, share some inspections with other people on the course. It's always good to get a second point of view. I mentored through the association a couple, husband and wife, who learnt beekeeping together, and Rebecca was blind. She was the one who really wanted to do the beekeeping, but her husband Manu, they learnt it together, and although obviously sort of Manu was the only one who could do certain things in the hive, Rebecca was always very ready to ask lots of questions and suggestions and probe and say, well, have you seen this? Have you seen what do you think that means? And so as a team, they worked really, really well together during their inspections. I've just shown you this as an example. So if you realise that to recognise the health of your colony, you need to see to the bottoms of the cells. You obviously can't do that when they're covered with bees like this. So you have to gently blow the bees away or shake them off into the hive. And well done, those of you who have spotted the queen's rear end there. This is the sort of thing that you're looking for in your colony, a lovely solid frame of developing brood, lovely matte cappings, none of them sunken. You can just about see the frames, the cells that have been missed out, where the wire is underneath in sort of roughly straight lines. Some possibly workers cleaning out cells that have hatched out recently in the middle there. But that's the sort of thing that you'd love to see in your colony. This is another picture which perhaps at first glance we might think looks fine. There's a couple of little holes there. Possibly they haven't been holes in the capping, they haven't been sealed over properly, but at just a cursory glance that might seem okay. It is okay, isn't it? So what I'm going to show you now is this yellow square, which that previous picture was taken from. And at first glance, I say that looks okay. But if I click again, then I would have concerns with every one of those cells that I've highlighted with the white arrows. So although some of the frame, imagine all that area with the white arrows had been covered in bees, and I only ever saw that one piece in the yellow box, then I would have a very lopsided view of what was going on in this hive. So I think there's pretty much something suspicious in every cell. There's probably about 40 or 50 arrows I've put in there. So you need to see the whole picture. You can't just sort of lift a frame up and see a few bees and say, I've got no varroa. Just sort of look at one frame and say, yeah, that hive looks healthy to me. You need, when you're doing your disease inspections, you need to do it thoroughly, and that'll get you understanding what's going on in the hive, even if it's not disease. Bit of a closer look at some of those pictures that I've shown on the previous slide, and we've got what look like sort of clear signs of EFB, possibly EFB that's dried out to form scales as well. That's been around for quite a while. So particularly this the sort of the cell that's sort of towards the top in the middle, instead of having a lovely plump C-shaped larvae, you've got one that's lying flat on the bottom of the cell, which is an unnatural position for it. So that's things you need to sort of keep an eye out for. Next slide. Lovely picture of healthy, plump, C-shaped tinned mandarin larvae. And again, a close-up of healthy larvae with the eggs at the very bottom. And when you think how this has been magnified on this picture, think of the actual size of a cell, then you'll begin to appreciate that if you do need reading glasses, you're probably going to need to put them on before you zip your bee suit up in order to be able to see everything in detail in the hive. And you'll get a lot more out of it by being able to see in detail like that. And although on this picture there are some plump, healthy looking larvae, there are an awful lot of larvae, as you can see by these yellow circles, that look distinctly unhealthy and horrible, and it's a sign of a European foul brood in the hive. So just a summary of everything that I've talked about. Bees catch diseases from other bees. We can't stop our own bees robbing someone else's colony which has died out of American foul brood. But what we can do is try and identify it if it happens in any of our bees, and even if we can't identify it, by our day-to-day activities, good apiary hygiene, hand washing, and use of washing soda in a bucket, we can prevent it spreading between our own colonies just by doing really simple basic things. So use a bucket of soda use a bucket of washing soda, not soda water, washing soda during your inspections. If you store unused equipment, then clean it before storing, and replace your comb regularly. And all those things will, if you build them into your basic hygienic practices, if you build them into your basic beekeeping, then they will help prevent you spreading disease between your colonies and manage disease levels within your colonies. And finally, you can only do those processes if you've got enough time to look at your bees. So what I would urge as well is that you manage your colony numbers, because bees are fantastic, but if, as I said before, if they expand to fill the time available for you looking at them, then that doesn't become so much fun. And so just keep an eye on your colony numbers and make sure that you're not getting more than you would like to, perhaps not just this year but the next year. And finally, learn to inspect your colonies in detail. You will get an awful lot of enjoyment out of it, and it'll make your beekeeping much more rewarding. You'll really start to learn, rather than learning out of books. You'll be starting to learn from your bees, and you can't do that by sitting back and just glancing at them. So get to know your bee colony intimately. So that's all I wanted to talk about today. Just a sort of a final slide to say, as I said before, that the bee inspection service is free of charge, and the bee inspector for our area, Cardiff and Vale, is Dan Baxter, and his details are there. I think they're on the Cardiff and Vale website, and they're also on the Bee-Base website. And so, I think that's everything for the moment. So, good luck with your beekeeping. And I say, think about what I've told you, and get to know your bees better by looking at them in great detail and trying to learn what they're doing. Thanks.